Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for this event. So these images, on the right is an image of Central Park about 1858. Things are just kind of getting dug up. There's a lot of kind of regrading going on, and there's a lot of attention to the quality of the soil, of the kind of meadowed surfaces, which are going to be really significant to its design. And a whole bunch of different fertilizers are going in to improve the soil, including night soil, horse manure, and then a series of kind of imported fertilizers, one of which is guano, which is coming from the Chinchas Islands in Peru, off the coast of Peru. And on the left side is an image of a guano deposit in the Chinchas Islands. And so guano is a very kind of, let's say, small component of the fertilizers that were used in Central Park, but I think they're a significant one, both in terms of kind of reflecting the metabolic transition that New York City, but also industrializing capitals around the world were undergoing. But kind of links, or in my project is an interest in trying to kind of unpack these iconic landscapes and try to understand some of the background, the kind of environment or the surroundings of how they became to be. And so I'm interested in light of this conference event, both in tracing these materials because they, within a design site, they're the things that produce sensorial effects, they produce performative qualities. They also are used, and I think highly in landscape architecture, as a mode to make symbols about human and non-human relationships. And then I'm interested in the fact that if you look at their kind of larger sourcing and production, you're actually seeing human, non-human interactions. So it's kind of unfolding in a symbolic way on the site, but it's also unfolding in the world. And so this, for me, is a part of a larger project which follows a number of case studies, all of certain materials which all ended up in New York City over the past 150 years. And guano, this is the earliest one. So Central Park, the kind of main agenda for the park was really to create a kind of pastoral proxy for citizens who were alienated, had no access to the farm anymore. It was considered kind of morally problematic to be disconnected from the landscape. A number of different fertilizers were being used, the ones that I mentioned. But in a way, the meadows were kind of the best example of this pastoral symbol, and the sheep grazing on the meadows were kind of an object lesson for kids who had never seen sheep and kind of needed to see what they looked like. At the same time, the sheep were chewing the grasses to make a kind of perfect surface, and these are quotes from Olmsted's writing in the annual reports, which describe the significance of this like perfect, tranquil surface of turf as a way to provide immunity from the violent city. He describes the fastidious way that this turf has to be managed. It has to be absolutely homogeneous. It cannot be too smoothly rolled. And then also, in a sense, the perfection of the turf was also used as a way to control use and occupation. It couldn't. Only certain uses were allowed intentionally to kind of control the way that people could inhabit it. And this is a famous example of that throughout the park, throughout its time. So as much as the park was a kind of symbol of a farm, it also functioned as one because it was a major piece of land in an urban environment. So it served to cycle a lot of the waste, the kind of new municipal waste dilemmas. This is horse manure of the city at the time. So the park was kind of an emergency composting lot for a lot of this kind of overproduction of material, which was based on the growing horse population. So night soil as well, collected from privies, was composted in the park and considered a really important amendment to the soil, but also the park and other exterior landscapes were critical for cycling that waste as well. And so as the New York City grew, the region grows, farms around the periphery are extending further, they're getting bigger, they're industrializing. And the kind of metabolic, the kind of traditional metabolic cycle of cycling organic waste within your farm expands to the scale of the region, and it starts to become, urban waste from New York City is being trucked out to the periphery, but it starts to become clear that the industrialization of the farms requires more stable, less kind of raunchy materials because they're starting to travel further. It's not about immediate cycling, it's about a much larger cycle. Which leads to the innovation of different kinds of products which are processed. This is night soil, which is turned into poudrette, a kind of fancy sounding French product, which is mixed with clay. And then guano, so Peruvian guano, is a newly available commodity which is incredibly successful for farm production, and is also, it's kind of I think of it kind of like a gateway towards more mined and non-renewable sources of fertilizer, because it's incredibly productive, and yet it's also still a manure. So people who were kind of set on using manures felt like it wasn't out of the range of what they were used to. So this is Olmsted's specification for the soil in Central Park. He's suggesting 1 part Peruvian guano and 3 parts American guano, which I'll talk about later. And he's using, this in small quantities, but he's a kind of cutting edge farmer and interested in agricultural, progressive agricultural practices, of which guano at the time was one of them. So nearby Central Park, in the agricultural kind of associations, there are huge debates about whether the use of these larger of these imported product fertilizers is a good idea or not. And George Waring, who's the agricultural engineer for Central Park, was against them. He thought that night soil and kind of local manures should be used. There should be a kind of direct exchange of the earth's fruits, whereas other people were very kind of committed to the exploration of imported fertilizers for their incredible ability to just produce a lot more stuff. But also, it was possible to think about these imported fertilizers from as far as Peru as actually part of the same metabolic cycle. So some people argued, we've got night soil going into the harbor, to the New York City harbor. It's going to the ocean. That water moves around the world. Fish eat that, birds eat that. Then they make guano. Then we buy that guano. Like it's the same cycle. So I think this is interesting in relation to Alessandra's point about, or the kind of question of what is your environment, what is your surrounding. So at this time, there's a kind of radical reshifting, a rescaling of what that might mean. So at the same time that Olmsted is specifying guano for Central Park, he is writing, or his book, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published, which is his analysis of both agricultural techniques in the seaboard slave states, but also his kind of awakening awareness of the practices of slavery as a journalist, essentially. And so one of the things that he highlights in this text is the way in which some of the plantation owners that he meets with think of guano as a possible saving grace by the fact that their fields are completely depleted. There's no nutrients left in them, and that depletion is potentially causing it's causing a lack of economic stability, which challenges their ability to possibly secede from the Union. And so at the same time, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist newspaper man, this is an article from 1855 which details, let's say, at the same time there, he's recognizing the significance of white slaveholders counting on guano as a possibility for kind of like saving their way of life, but is also recognizing that there's a new form of slavery happening in the world, which is directly linked to guano, which is basically happening on the coast of Peru. So he's calling it kind of more gruesome than anything that we've seen before. So these are the Chinchas Islands, which are really small islands off the coast of Pisco. This is George Washington Peck, a naturalist, describing these islands as absolutely teeming with life. They're just kind of surrounded with sea life and bird life. The Andes are on your right. This kind of just cacophony of life. This is the way that guano works. It kind of functions like a glacier. It moves independently from the bedrock below. And this guano, and in the Chinchas Islands, the guano was accumulating at about 2 centimeters a year. So the deposit there is about 2,000 years old. which means that, well, and distinct to this area, which is one of the reasons why this was such an important deposit, is that there's no rain here. So in any other place, this would just be kind of ebbing and flowing, but here, it really has kind of the ability to accumulate. And so, this is the Peru. The Humboldt Current is a kind of a cold water upwelling, which is feeding just hordes and hordes of fish in the water, which is supporting an incredibly vivacious bird population, productive bird population, feeding those fish, and producing guano through their own basic. Is that 10 minutes? I've gone? Okay. So through their, is it about what I have or what I get? Yeah. Okay. So basically, guano is the aggregation of all of these different bodies and their excrement and other kinds of sea life, a kind of heterogeneous mixture that becomes a homogeneous solid powder, like a perfect white commodity. And so when its ability to kind of transform agricultural industries became aware that it was so valuable, this incredibly rich ecosystem becomes basically just a gold mine overnight. And it's essentially depleted over about 30 years. This is Peck's description of the loading of guano into a chute in the way that it makes a kind of yellow smoke cloud. Guano is inert when it's solid, but once you start harvesting it by kind of chipping away at it, it becomes a pulverous cloud, and it's incredibly acrid and dangerous and terrible for your lungs and eyes. So nobody wanted to do this. And so this was essentially the motivator to redirect the Atlantic slave trade, the infrastructure of the Atlantic slave trade towards China. So as abolition had already occurred in Peru and Britain, the kind of machine of slavery essentially moved towards southern China and began taking Chinese laborers under false contracts, like supposed short-term working contracts. But once they were on the boat, the kind of world of the mechanisms of slavery came back entirely. So thousands of Chinese workers worked on the Chinchas Islands, and many hundreds died on the way. So essentially that deposit was depleted within 30 years, but the kind of guano fever continues. The United States is unsatisfied with Peru's monopoly over guano, and so passes an act which basically gives any American right to obtain an island of guano as long as no one's on it. So they did. Including Baker's Island. This is one of 60 in the South Pacific. There's 40 more in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. The U.S. still has tenure over many of them. And essentially, the rapid depletion of guano leads to the rapid depletion of other forms of mineral fertilizers. And just the German chemist Justus von Liebig writes here he's kind of cautioning about this idea that fields are inexhaustible, and he's cautioning that the use of these kind of mined and kind of high potency guano, as opposed to cycling local nutrients, is really a disaster waiting to happen. And his work really ends up influencing Marx's theory of social metabolism and the whole idea about unequal ecological exchange between the city and the country. Ironically, von Liebig's amazing work in chemistry, leads to the development of the Haber-Bosch process, which is the simulation of ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen, which is really the basis for our contemporary global food industry, and also our $30 billion landscaping industry, which is essentially the kind of offspring of the farm, so the American lawn, essentially. Which is also, the kind of basis for the very specific atmosphere of hanging out in the sheep meadow today, and pretty much any kind of large-scale urban public landscape, sports landscape, leisure landscape, and the kind of homogeneous, luxurious quality of that. These guys work at the reserve, the ecological reserve that's on the Chinchas Islands now. So the Chinchas Islands were completely eradicated of guano, as well as the bird population over, in many different ways over the last century. Today, there's a very innovative and interesting ecological reserve program there, which is essentially a kind of selective harvesting idea, which is about gathering guano as it accumulates in a very kind of selective way in order to foster the bird population, but also to kind of support the local domestic organic farming movement. So this is a whole archipelago up the coast of Peru through which the reserve program works. There's a kind of limit on industrial fishing in this area, which is meant to foster the bird population as well. This is the kind of former infrastructure today, and this is a closed down hospital that used to be in operation in the past century. And these are photographs of by photographer Thomas. These last three photographs are by Thomas Munita, who's a photographer who's documenting the actual process of harvesting, which today is done by workers from the Andes, primarily migrant workers from the Andes. It's done in exactly the same way. It's done by hand. And there are obviously no photos of the earlier, or kind of documents of the earlier form of harvesting, but these photographs represent exactly the way that harvesting is described. So for me, this project, but also my kind of larger project, is really about trying to see what forcing the adjacency of otherwise completely disparate or distant landscapes, how that might help us think through the one that we know and love so much and obsess over and talk about and kind of rarefy the Central Park project. So to kind of unpack exactly how it came to be, but also to look critically and think critically about the symbols that are embedded in those landscapes and how they relate to the kind of real relations, the social and ecological relations of the making of landscape. Thank you.